Today's After Effects tutorial is about bubblegum, specifically blowing some bubbles and popping them. It's pretty simple, uses shape layers, and it probably won't get stuck in your hair if you go to sleep with it in your mouth. Inside After Effects, create a new composition. I'm going to be working with an HD TV 1080p 24 frames a second, so just keep in mind that any values I call out are within reference to this size of frame. So if you're using a smaller frame and a different number of frames per second, when I say things like go ahead 10 frames, that's going to be a different timing to you. When I say make a circle that's 500 pixels large, that's going to mean something different if that's your entire frame. So just remember, when I use values, it's in relation to the size of the frame. But other than that, I don't really care. The first thing we do is make a new solid, and that solid is going to be our background, so make it 95% bright, nothing else, and just rename it background, and then lock that layer because I'm not interested in touching it. I'm told that bubblegum is something you chew and then you spit it out of your mouth halfway, and then you pop it and then you bring it back into your mouth and chew it some more. That sounds gross, but thankfully I don't have to touch it if I make it in After Effects. So we're going to make it out of shape layers, which do not get stuck in my chest hair. So we're going to make a new shape layer, and on that shape layer we're going to add an ellipse, and we're going to add a polystar, and then we're going to add a fill. And this fill, we are going to make it a hue of, say, 325, which is a nice bubblegum tone, and we're going to put the saturation down at something like 60. We're going to make the size something like 500 by 500, and the position we'll leave alone. Now the polystar, we are going to use this to create that point that comes out of someone's mouth. So it's going to have 4 points, and it's going to have a rotation of 45, and its inner and outer radiuses, radii, I don't know, give me something like 75, 150, and then we're just going to move its position so that it's sticking out of the side of the balloon here, and maybe that's at 150 by 150, that's sticking out. That's a bit much. 125, 125, and then we just got to adjust the size up to fit a little bit better. Alright, that's pretty good. So it looks kind of like a speech bubble is what we're driving at here. So this is going to be our main shape, and we use this to create all the rest of the things. So one of the things we need to do to the shape of this bubble here is make it a little bit rougher, because even though bubbles look spherical, I'm sure for cartoon purposes they shouldn't be. We're going to use a roughen edges on it. That's good. And we're going to set the border to something like 10, and we're going to set the scale to 200. Now the border is the space that defines the inside and outside most change that we're going to have. So basically it's 5 pixels on either side of the alpha channel, and within that it's going to have the rest of these settings happening. It's basically using a fractal to say, I'm going to make this now a wavy alpha instead of a straight one, and you can change its complexity and all that, but basically we're scaling up the size of that fractal by a factor of 2, so from 100 to 200%, and we're making the border a bit larger. So it's created this kind of wavy line instead of the straight line, and then we're going to apply a turbulent displace. What the roughen edges does to just the edges of things, a turbulent displace does to pretty much all of the thing. So we're going to have an amount of like 10 and a size of 350, but you might need to tweak these, depending on the size of what you've got going on. So maybe something like 500 makes more sense, but what this does is it just makes things a little bit less spherical and a little bit less clean. It takes the work out of having to do this all by hand. Now we'll just rename this layer something like bubble bottom, which I think means something else in other communities, and then duplicate that layer. And we'll call this one bubble middle. We'll leave most of the settings the same, except we'll be changing the fill here to be 50 saturation, and we'll just hit UU to bring up everything about this layer. We don't need the polystar, get rid of it, and we do need to add another ellipse to it, and we're also going to need to add a merge paths to it. And the merge paths will be operating on an intersection, so it is the intersection of ellipse path 1 and ellipse path 2. Ellipse path 1 is nicely defining a border around the outside of this shape, so I'm happy with that. Ellipse path 2, however, will be sort of cutting into that. So let's just change the position first off to be at -25, -25, so it's slightly off center. and then we'll change the size to be 520. So now it creates this sort of shading down here that we wanted, and it's made this part lighter, because as a bubble expands and stretches, it's becoming lighter because there's less pigment and less stuff suspended in that gum. So that's just some fun facts about gum. Now duplicate that, and we'll call this bubble top. Hit U again to call up all those properties. Change the position to be minus 100, minus 100, and we're going to bring the size down to something like 200 by 200. That's pretty good. And its fill again, we're going to change the saturation down to 40. So it's getting even lighter up here at the top, and that's creating a nice little highlight. So what we've created is kind of like the end state or middle state that we want the bubble to blow up to and appear pretty much normal. So what we'll do is we're going to move ahead 60 frames, and I do that by holding down Shift and hitting page down 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 times, moving ahead 60 frames. We're going to want to set keyframes on things like ellipse path 2's position and size. Same thing for bubble middle, size and position of those. And bubble bottom, we are just going to use its scale. So now select all those layers, hit U to bring them all up. Let's zoom in a little bit here so we can see more clearly what we're doing. This is the state we want to achieve. So we've set keyframes there, and now we move back to the beginning, and we're going to set up the position where all of these things start. So for example, the position here is going to start at 0, 0. The position of this other one is going to be 0, 0 as well. We know that we want their size to as well be zeros, so just zero all those out. And then finally, the bubble bottom will be scaled down to 0, so that when it animates on, that's kind of how it looks. But it's not exactly what we're going for, just because we want to make sure that it's coming out of this point over here. So go here to the last keyframe, hit Y to use your pan behind, and just grab bubble bottom's keyframe and put it down in the corner here. So it animates up from that position, and also you want to parent bubble top and bubble middle to it. So here on the last keyframe, parent those to bubble bottom. And what you get is this growing highlight here that gets bigger and kind of has a bit more of a natural look. So parenting these things together is a helpful step. Now the next thing to do is to set some intermittent keyframes in here. So we've got the start and the end state, but we want it to kind of puff up with breaths. So not one steady motion, but kind of like that. Move ahead to about frame 20 and set keyframes there for everybody involved. Move ahead another couple and set keyframes there for everybody. And one thing you might want to do actually is, instead of having the highlight start right at the beginning, drag its keyframes here to only start at the first interval. So it's going to have one breath, there's no highlight, and then the next breath, the highlight's coming on. Set keyframes like that. So your keyframes should look kind of like mine. Now the next thing we want to do is induce kind of a rotation that's happening while this thing is coming up. So as it fills with air, we want it to be shaking around like the air is flowing into it unevenly. Now we're going to do that by using the rotation. So select the layer, Shift R to pull up the rotation, and we're going to actually add a slider control to that layer that is going to help us control the rotation. Basically, we want the slider influence to be at 0 at all of these points. So we know here when it's resting, we want it to be 0. We'd like it to be 0 there, so copy and paste the frame. We know at the start we want it to be 0, so copy and paste there. And then at the end, paste one there so that it's stable. But in between, we want to be having something influence its rotation. So the slider control, think of it as we're saying influence it by this amount. So the slider control is going to be a 5 there, and then here between these two frames it's going to be a 10. Go ahead again, and then it's going to be a 15. Go ahead some more, and it's going to be a 20. And then just select all those keyframes, hit F9 to easy ease them, and then call up that rotation again, hold down Alt and click on its stopwatch. And then you are going to type in an expression that will be wiggle, and then in brackets 2, comma, and then pick whip to that slider control. And then close off with a bracket, and you're good. So as it comes up, it's getting more wiggly towards the middle and shaking around a bit. So now what we want to do is select all these other keyframes, and we're going to easy ease them as well. And then go into our graph editor here, select all those, and we're going to make these breaths a bit more pronounced. So as you can see, when they're easy eased, it does stop, velocity reaches 0 at each of the keyframes. But we want to drag out those handles a bit, increase their influence, just so that the effect becomes a little bit more pronounced. So you just grab the handles and squish them around to look more like mountains instead of bumps. So that creates a harsher in and then an easier out. So that motion is looking pretty spot on, actually. So now let's go ahead to the final phase when we pop this thing. So we're going to go ahead 20 keyframes after everything's reached our desired functional end state, and we're going to set the scale of bubble bottom to be 200, so really, really big. And at the same time, we're going to be changing the position of bubble middle to be at 0, 0, and we're going to be changing both the size and position of the highlight to be at 0, 0, and quite large. Maybe not at 0, 0, maybe at -25, -25, but definitely quite large, because this is when the bubble is getting its most stretched and it's about to pop. So select all those keyframes, go into the graph editor, and we're going to drag the handle of all those keyframes to be all the way over to this side, and then drag the other keyframe handle, and then drag the other handles to create this ramp as well. So make sure they're all ramping up in the same way. You don't want any of them lagging behind and just bringing the entire experience down. But you can see it starts to accelerate towards that end state. Now go back a keyframe from the end and trim all the paths, holding down Alt and then close square bracket, so that they all end just as they're getting to their maximum. And that's when the pop happens. So the pop is going to occur at the last possible second. And now we're going to draw a whole new shape to be the popped thing. So we're going to go Layer, New, Shape Layer, and we're going to again add an ellipse to this, and then we're going to add another ellipse, and then we're going to add a merge paths. The merge paths this time is going to be operating on a subtract, and then we're going to add a wiggle paths in here, and then we're going to add a fill. So we've got a lot of things going on. First thing that we have here is a fill that needs a correct color. So we're going to use the medium color here, the largest one, good, just because it has the most area and the bubble will probably pop and look like that. It's not going to be exact, but I don't really care. So move ahead, and we want this layer to start once the other layer is gone. So that's there, this is here, we're all good. You don't want them to overlap because that would look a little bit funny. So we want ellipse path 1 to be quite large. It's going to be a total of 960 large to start with, and just hit the keyframe there because we are going to mess around with that. Ellipse path 2 we would like to be at 0 because it hasn't started to tear open the bubble yet. And set a keyframe there because it's going to change. Now the other thing we need to change here is the wiggle path. The wiggle path basically takes the vector line and wiggles it around much in the same way that the roughen edges does, but only for vectors. And it can create some really interesting things when you start putting it over a bunch of stuff. So you'll see what I mean here in a minute. So its size is going to start off at 140, which is quite large, and we're going to set the detail to be 2. So it's not very detailed. And instead of a corner, it's going to be smooth. So you don't want jagged bubbles. That just doesn't make any sense. You're going to set keyframes there on the wiggle path size and detail, and you don't need to look at anything else, so just hit U to call up only those. Now we're going to move ahead a frame, and we're going to change the size of the outer part to be 1200, and then the inside is going to come up to be 540. So it's starting to rip open here. Now the size of the wiggle is going to come up to 250, and the detail is going to move up to 4. So it's getting more detailed and more interesting. Move ahead another frame, and this is the big one where we're going up to 2200, and then we're going up to also 1600, and then we're going 540 on the size of the wiggle, and detail is going up to 8. And that is the end, so you can trim the path off right there. So that is it for the vector work. Now we need to add some more interesting stuff like the turbulent displace to this bursting bubble here. So copy and paste it on there. And the displacement on this one is going to get a little bit extreme. So it's going to get keyframed as well. So we're going to be keyframing the amount and the size. And instead of turbulent, it's going to be on bulge. When we look here at its keyframes now, we would like the first one for the amount to be at 50 and for the size to be at around 100. Now the next one, it's going to get a little bit more extreme again, so the amount is going up to 100, and then the next amount is going to be 300, so just crazy high numbers. And then the size also is going to be growing too, so it's going to go from 100 up to 125, and then size goes up to 150. So you can see it creates these tears and little pockets everywhere, and what you might want to do is consider even taking it down, so instead of going up in size, it goes slightly down so it creates more tears, but that's, you know, just a point of preference. But you can see that it creates these interesting pockets and tears everywhere, and that's really the kind of look we're going for. Now we're going to take the roughen edges and apply that too, so copy it off another layer, paste it here, just to get that fine change in the edges. One thing to know about roughen edges though is that it does weird stuff at the edges of your frame because it's the alpha as it is relative to the frame. So it's going to roughen the edges of your frame up. If you want to avoid doing that, you just need to pre-compose and then grow the layer a little bit. But essentially, that is it for the piece. So the bubble gets a bit bigger and pops. What we did for the purpose of the intro was to put a layer behind here that was text. So we create a new text layer, and you can see that this starts to alter the way things look because it's all based on random seeds. So if you start adding more layers, you're going to get different looks. If you want to go back and change things, you have to go into the layer, change the random seed. The text here, we're going to do something like type in bubble. We're using the font Cooper Standard, black italic. And what we'll do is we will just set this to be of a size, you know, that's large enough. Set its color to be the same color as the popping bubble. Use the align panel to stick it roughly in the center. And now we want to find a frame where it will be totally covered up. That looks good enough. Use the scale here to maybe make it a little bit smaller. Set a keyframe for its scale and for its rotation while we're at it. Move ahead maybe 5 frames, and we'll just rotate it about -8 so the italics line up, and then we'll just scale it up a little bit like so, and then easy ease both of those. Go into the graph editor here and just grab those handles like this, and boom, so it pops and it's like the bubble word is coming out of the bubble. Now it doesn't look terribly exciting, so maybe you want to add something like a drop shadow to it. Put that on there. Instead of using black, just use the same color and up the saturation a little bit, and then amplify that a little bit. So it kind of looks a little bit interesting. Maybe instead you want to have its opacity be at 100, which I do, and then we'll just crank that up a little bit. And now we will apply to this bubble text the same roughen edges and turbulent displace that we've been using all throughout. So paste that on there, and it gets a little bit more bubbly, doesn't it? That's a little bit bubbly. So that's all good. Now just set the word bubble behind everything, and there you go. Perfect. So this has been Evan Abrams. Thank you so much for watching. If you had trouble with the tutorial, go ahead and leave me a question in the comments section, and I'll try to help you out as best I can. And if you enjoyed this tutorial, give it the old thumbs up there. That really helps out. And of course, if this is the kind of thing you like to see, then definitely subscribe, because there's new tutorials here every week. And if it was super hard for you, you can always download the project file from evanabrams.com, where there's a bunch of other interesting things you might enjoy. And of course, hit me up on the Twitter at ECAbrams if you just want to jam about After Effects, and get involved on the Facebook page, because I try to tweet and post things that are inspiring to me in my motion graphics career. Hopefully this has been helpful to you. Go ahead and subscribe, and I will see you next week. Thanks a lot, and have a nice day.